Good to go.
How's it going, everybody? Welcome to the Third Line Plug's Senscast. I am your host, Taylor Gibson. Joining me, as always, from the tropical metropolis of Calgary, Alberta, my co-host, Tim Gensey. Tim, how's it going, sir?
Going pretty good, and I'm sure you're going to go on all about it, but I'm pretty excited for what we're about to do here today.
Absolutely, man, because, and I know for the last couple of days, I've been super excited, and I couldn't wait to get this interview started. Since starting this podcast 3 years ago, we've gotten the opportunity to talk with some high-profile people, including former NHLer Jamie McLennan and longtime Sens reporter Ian Mendes. Our guest today is without question the most significant individual we have ever gotten to chat with for the podcast. Our guest today is a successful entrepreneur and real estate broker/developer in the city of Ottawa. He has served as an entrepreneur in residence at the Telfer School of Management at the University of Ottawa. He is also a published author and former sports owner, serving as part owner and chairman of the now defunct Ottawa Rough Riders of the Canadian Football League, as well as part of the advisory board for the Ontario Hockey League's Ottawa 67s. For his contributions with Ottawa sports franchises, he was inducted into the Ottawa Sports Hall of Fame in 2012. With all of his accomplishments, though, he will be best remembered for his role in the National Hockey League's return to the city in Ottawa in 1992 as founder of the modern-day Ottawa Senators. Ladies and gentlemen, joining us from our nation's capital of Ottawa, Ontario, the founder of your Ottawa Senators, our guest, Dr. Bruce Firestone. Bruce, how's it going? Welcome to the podcast.
Hi, Taylor. Hi, Tim. I'm glad to be on the podcast with you guys and to hockey fans and sports fans, especially now in the year of COVID-19. Not much to cheer for.
No, it's definitely been, but especially with the last couple of years of Senators hockey, it's really hasn't given us a lot to cheer about. But, with the upcoming draft and the future looking so bright, better days are ahead.
Yeah, we hope so, for sure. One of the things about the current state of the Ottawa Senators, apart from the fact that the NHL, the NBA, and Major League Baseball are not playing right now, is that there's a bit of unease, I think, in the fan base. So there's kind of a disconnect between the team and the fans. And that is the first time, Taylor and Tim, that's happened in the history of the modern-day Ottawa Senators.
For sure.
Yeah, and as a fan of the Senators, really a lot of sports times, I think it might be one of the first times I've kind of seen it in a Canadian team.
Yeah, I think that's right, Tim. If you look at it, certainly from the time that we announced in, I think it was 1987, so a long time ago, that we're going to bring back the Ottawa Senators, a team that hadn't played in the NHL since 1933 or 34, when they went out of business due to the Great Depression. There was a lot of excitement, and it just built and built and built until finally we got an expansion franchise in December of 1990, and then started play in October of 1992. There was an incredibly intense love affair between the team and the fans. It was certainly as intense a love affair as exists anywhere in the National League. But in the last couple of years anyway, that love affair has certainly cooled.
So, Bruce, before we head into the interview, given that we are in the middle of the COVID pandemic, we got to ask right off the top, how have you and your family been holding up during the pandemic?
We're fine. For people who are my age, I'm in my late 60s now. For people my age, we have to be really cautious about it. But certainly all of my friends and colleagues and clients, totally respect the need for isolation. And so far, myself, my wife, my 5 kids, my grandsons are fine. But my heart goes out to, we're losing today maybe the greatest generation that ever lived. My father, your grandfather, your grandmother, my mother, that generation, they took us from, literally horse and buggy in the early 1900s to the moon in the 1960s. They brought about all these wonderful computers and services that we all sort of almost take for granted today, the internet, of course, and all the other things that go with it. And those people are really, really suffering now. They're dying by the tens of thousands across the world. And it's a very, very tough time. Not to mention the fact that 7.2 million Canadians are on the CERB benefit, the Canadian Emergency Response Benefit, and 40 million Americans are unemployed. So we're in for really tough times.
For sure, and we haven't seen half of it, given that mortgages aren't forgiven, they're deferred.
Yeah, I agree with that, and I actually did a speech, obviously on Zoom or Skype, you can do that sort of thing, not in person, but I did a speech for a group, and I actually went back to the beginning of the Industrial Revolution, which was the early 1700s, and I could not find another example of major economies like China, like the United States, like Canada, contracting by 40% in 3 months. China's economy, I think, GDP decreased by 40% in the first quarter of 2020, and I think Canada and the United States are not far behind. And even in the Great Depression of the 1930s, Canada, Germany, and the United States, they did suffer a 40% decrease in industrial production, but that took almost 4 years. This is happening in 3 months. That I think is unprecedented.
Well, it's interesting because, even before the Industrial Revolution, we did do some sorts of isolation, but never at this scale. And I think the closest thing we really saw was the cholera riots of the 1830s.
Yeah, and I'm old enough to remember, the polio epidemic of the 50s and 60s, and my parents wouldn't let me go to any places where large numbers of people were gathering because children were contracting polio, and that was a devastating disease. If you contracted it as a child, if it didn't kill you, it certainly impacted the rest of your life. So we have been through pandemics before, but I have never. I just couldn't find another example where major economies were contracting at contracting at the rate that we're seeing.
So, Bruce, before embarking on bringing the National Hockey League back to Ottawa, you attended and received a Bachelor of Civil Engineering from McGill University in Montreal, later traveling to Australia to attend the University of New South Wales and the Australian National University, where you would later receive a Master of Engineering Science and a PhD in Urban Economics, respectively. What sparked your interest in pursuing a career in real estate development, and overall, how did you enjoy your time attending those universities?
Well, I was at McGill at a very interesting time. It was, really the start of Quebec becoming its own nation. A lot of Canadians, outside of Quebec, maybe if you haven't lived there, might not really grasp just how different the province is and how important it was for the people who lived there, many of them, to protect their language and culture. So it was a very interesting time to live in Montreal, to go to the university. There was a lot of political agitation, and some of the rioting that we're seeing in the United States, we had that here in Canada, at least in Montreal, certainly around where I lived. Is people were not happy in Quebec that they felt their language was under threat. So there was a lot of political uncertainty. You guys are, I think, much too young to remember the first Prime Minister, Trudeau, facing down the FLQ and the murder of at least one cabinet minister in Quebec, and the declaration of what really amounts to martial law. And I can remember going up on Mount Royal in downtown Montreal. The army had moved into Montreal and basically occupied the city, and it was a time of flux. And even before that, I had spent time in California at the University of California at Santa Cruz, which is about an hour south of Berkeley. The year was 1969. You can imagine, if you've ever seen any films of that time, the tremendous opposition amongst young people to the Vietnam War. So I was fairly involved in sort of those kinds of activities, at least on the periphery, and I got a real taste of what it's like to see the kinds of unrest that we're seeing today.
In doing research for this interview, I was actually quite fascinated in learning how the initial idea for the Bring the Senators Back campaign came to be. Now, from what I understand, during a weekly terrace meeting in 1987, the initial idea for the NHL's return to Ottawa was tabled by a gentleman named Duncan MacDonald after reading it in the Ottawa Citizen sports section about expansion plans in the 1990s. Following this, I understand that you had sat on the idea until you had accepted that Ottawa was ready again to support a franchise. A decision was made to launch the bid through Terrace Investments as part of the development plan. And then following a game of shinny hockey, you mentioned your plan to a couple of executives named Randy Sexton and Cyril Leader. What kind of a reaction did you receive from Randy and Cyril regarding your plan? And overall, what kind of exception did you get about the bid?
Well, what happened was I was living in Australia. My wife and I, we have 5 kids today, but back then we only had one, and our oldest boy was born in Australia. I was at the Australian National University doing my PhD, and quite happy. I was on track to become a university professor. Probably that's what I'm best suited for. And my dad came to see me, wanted to see his new grandson. He was living here in Ottawa. I was living in Canberra. And Dad told me that his business in Ottawa was not doing very well. He was in the real estate business. And he said, Bruce, can you come back? This is 1983, I think. Just for 6 months and help me out because, I need some help. So I consulted with my wife, and she said, okay, and I came back to Canada. And I found that my dad had invested in, I think there were 5 or 6 roller disco rinks. I don't know, you guys probably don't even know what a roller disco rink is.
I think it's somewhere where you wear a polyester suit.
That's pretty close. So I didn't know. I mean, I don't even know if they had disco music in Australia. I didn't know anything about it. So I came back to Ottawa, and I went to one of these places. I rented a pair of roller skates. And what happens, Tim, is you put your roller skates on, and you skate in circles. There's like a disco ball, disco lights, and Donna Summer's music is playing. And then after a few minutes, the music stops, and so everybody stops, so I stop. And then the music starts, and the lights get going, but this time you have to skate in the opposite direction, right? So you go clockwise, or you go counterclockwise. It was incredibly boring. And so I come off the, I did it for 50 or 60 minutes. I came off the rink, and I took my roller skates off. And the next day I talked to the guys that my dad was in partnership with, and I said, I'll tell you what, guys, I'll trade you the half of the real estate that you own for the half of the operating business that we own. And they were older than me, and they said, oh, Bruce, you're a young guy. I was in my 20s. You don't really know what you're talking about. The roller disco business is a cash cow. We'd be taking advantage. I said, no, it's okay. I don't know anything about roller disco, but I know a little bit about real estate. You have the operating company. We'll keep the real estate. And they agreed, and they thought they were taking advantage.
Wait. They let you trade the flow for the stock?
Pretty much.
Jesus Christ.
Yeah. Anyway, so 18 months later, the roller disco fad just died. You couldn't pay a teenager to go to these places. When teens change their minds about something, that's it, it's done. So they went bankrupt, and we ended up owning these 6 huge warehouses, beautifully fit up with, wood floor that you could polish to the nth degree. And it was just the beginning of the tech boom in Ottawa, and it was the time when there was a thing called management by wandering around. That was a big management theory, that if you were the executive director or the president, CEO, whatever, chief operating officer, you wanted everybody sort of on one level where you could just kind of wander around and manage by wandering around, MBWA. And by the way, when I was on the board of governors of the National Hockey League about 10 years later, I said to Gary Bettman the same thing. At that time, the NHL had major offices in Montreal and 2 major offices in New York and 1 in Toronto, at least 4. And I said to Gary, you've got to bring them all together. I mean, I'm a proud Canadian for sure, but, you want to be in one location because the theory is that the most productive meetings are the ones that kind of happen by happenstance. You meet somebody at the water cooler or the photocopier. Oh, hey, Tim, Taylor, I meant to tell you, blah, blah, blah. So anyway, those 6 warehouses were, within a few months, were filled up with tech companies paying really good rents. And I learned the magic of real estate, which is you increase the revenues for the projects that you own, whether they're residential or they're commercial, doesn't really matter. Up goes the value. You can refinance, reappraise, take some money out tax-free, and then go out and buy some more stuff. So that's what I did. And then after a few years of building a bit of a real estate empire, you've got to remember when I took over that business, maybe our first year revenues, guys, were $350,000 a year, so it was a really small company. But by 8 or 9 years later, we were doing about $120 million in sales. The problem, though, was that other people, like very well capitalized firms like pension funds, insurance companies, REITs, real estate investment trusts, and others were entering the business with very low cost of funds. So it'd be like the three of us going and, challenging Usain Bolt to a race. He's probably going to beat us, right? These guys had a very low cost of funds. We were paying much, much higher interest rates. So we had to pivot. And the question was to pivot to what? So I am going to answer your question. And what we decided to pivot to was one of two things. We were either going to go into the mini storage business, or we were going to go and buy 600 acres of land, bid for an NHL expansion franchise, put it in the middle of the property, drive up the value of the land, sell off the 500 acres we didn't need, make a bunch of money, pay for the expansion franchise, and life would be good. So when I talked to Randy Sexton and Cyril Leader after we had a pickup hockey game, and I said, these are my two ideas, Randy, who is an MBA from Clarkson in the States and a hockey guy, immediately, let's go after the NHL expansion franchise. And the first question from Cyril, who's a chartered accountant, was, how much is it going to cost?
Well, it's funny, and I was reading through your book, and the one thing that I noticed when I was reading about Cyril Leader and his attitude towards the hockey team being more cautious, that seems like a very kind of Canadian thing to do, is that we don't run on emotion, we run more on logic more than anything. Is that something that you would agree with?
Oh, well, Cyril is very, very logical. You know, he was with me at Terrace Investments Limited and then with the Ottawa Senators for 35 years until Mr. Melnick fired him.
Well, I wonder how much of it's logic versus risk aversion.
Well, it's a bit of both. Canadians are very cautious, and we're right to be cautious because, if you go to the smallest town, Tim, the smallest little town you can find in the United States, you're going to find a couple of billionaires there. I mean, it's just incredible the amount of money that the American economy is producing, especially if you're in the top 1% or 0.1%. But in Canada and Australia is very similar, and I think New Zealand as well. Money is more evenly distributed, but it also means that we just don't have as many rich people.
Mm-hmm.
Following your decision to put in an expansion bid, Terrace Investments publicly announced for the first time their intentions in reviving the Ottawa Senators by way of expansion in June 1989. You had obtained permission to use the name from the descendants of Tommy Gorman, who was the owner of the original Senators and the 1950 Senior Hockey Club, as well as settled with the owners of the Ottawa Junior Senators prior to the announcement. One thing a younger generation of fans may not realize regarding the bid itself was that it was considered a long shot given Ottawa's market size, the lack of a new arena, and the fact it was going up against a heavily favored bid from the city of Hamilton. Despite its long shot status, how much faith did you have in the Senators' bid, and did you ever think that it would have beaten out the bid from Hamilton?
Well, if you're an entrepreneur, entrepreneurs don't die. They just say they're life challenged. Entrepreneurs are the kind of people who are not easily dissuaded. They're not easily discouraged. And certainly I would fit into that category. And, the team around me, we were very young. I was in my late 30s, and Cyril Leader and Randy Sexton and the rest of our group were in their late 20s or early 30s. So it was a very young group. And we would have done almost anything to get the franchise. When we went down to Palm Beach to the winter meetings that the National League was holding that year, that would have been December of 1990. We took 120 people down to Palm Beach with us. We had the Ottawa Fire Department marching band. We had incredible followers come down there, including, of course, Frank Finnigan from the Sens days in the 20s and 30s. He was with us with, like I said, 120 other people, and we plastered the entire town. You couldn't take a taxi cab, you couldn't go in an elevator without saying, "Bring back the Ottawa Senators" sticker. So we wanted to make sure that the Board of Governors heard our voices and heard the passion of the fans. And in terms of market size, even back then, Canadian cities might be smaller and not as rich as American cities, but the percentage of the population that are rabid hockey fans is much higher than, say, Los Angeles. So even though LA is obviously much, much, much bigger and much wealthier than say, Ottawa is, or for that matter, Calgary, or Duncan, BC, I might add, even so, there are a lot of hockey fans in Ottawa. And, I have said publicly now for more than 20 years, I even said it in 1990 at the NHL winter meetings that I think Canada should have more NHL teams. We don't have a team in Quebec City. We don't have a team in Hamilton, and I think we should.
Well, I know I was talking to one of our friends for the podcast who lives in southern Ontario, and we were talking about Ottawa getting the team over Hamilton, and he was saying to me, economically, it actually, in retrospect, nowadays looking at it, it makes more sense Ottawa got it over Hamilton, given that the steel industry ended up falling apart and all the Ford plants in southern Ontario closed. Looking back, was that something that I don't think any of us could have really seen that happening?
Well, I think the real turning point for us was the fact that we had only a very small arena at that time, the Ottawa Civic Center, which could seat 10 or 12,000 people. We didn't have a modern NHL caliber arena. Actually, it worked in our favor, Taylor. What happened was the Cops Coliseum, as it was called at that time in Hamilton, could seat 18,000 people, so that was certainly a plus. But it didn't have a lot of the amenities that the NHL at that time was looking for in terms of private suites and signage and sponsorship and other revenue streams. So what we did was we looked, Randy and Cyril and I and others, we looked at about 30 different arenas and stadiums, and I wanted to hire an architect designer that had not built stadiums before or arenas before, or not very many of them. And one of the things that we did was we went to Detroit and we saw what Gino Rossetti, the architect of record for the Palace of Auburn Hills, where the Detroit Pistons play. And I talked to Gino, and he had only ever done, at that time, one arena, and it was that one, the Palace. And it had rows of suites. And that was a real fundamental change in the economics of NHL hockey, which is, even to this day, very dependent on on bums in the seats. That's what they literally call it, BIMs. People, paying season tickets. It's not like the NBA or the National Football League, which have massive, massive television contracts. And so what Gino had done is he had revolutionized the economics. And most of the arenas in the NHL at that time were like the old Chicago Stadium, or the Boston Garden, which were very, very, very basic and didn't have the modern amenities or the revenue streams. And so what I was able to do when I was talking to members of the Board of Governors, and I spent about 2 years on a plane, I went to visit every member of the Board of Governors except one, and I would tell them all kinds of lies about me, what a great guy I am. I tell them all kinds of nice things about the city of Ottawa, but I also educated them as to what was going on with arena design. So when we actually got to December of 1990, the fact that Hamilton had an existing arena that looked pretty much like an old, Boston Garden or Chicago Stadium, and that we had a design that Gino had come up with for what was then called the Palladium, now Canadian Tire Center, with much, much stronger revenue streams. I think the Board of Governors really looked at Ottawa's bid and liked it.
I guess two follow-up questions I have. First, did you ever meet the guy from Hartford?
No, he was Mr. Invisible. I don't think anybody ever saw that guy. I spent, like I said, Tim, I spent 2 years on a plane. How many times did I go to Vancouver and Chicago and L.A.? Bruce McNall was the owner of the L.A. Kings at that time. He was quite the character, by the way. And, I got to know the members of the board. I had my own favorites. I was very fond of Mike Ilitch. Unfortunately, he's passed away now, but he was the owner of the Detroit Red Wings and later on the Detroit Tigers of Major League Baseball. I was very fond of Bill Wirtz, the owner of the Chicago team. And Mr. Wirtz would tell me things like, he'd say, he had that accent, that Midwest accent, kind of like this. He would say things like, you want to know what the key is to running an NHL team, Bruce? When you've got somebody who's been involved with NHL hockey as long as the Wirtz family is, since the 1930s, it pays to pay attention. So I said, what's the key, Mr. Wirtz? What is it, Bill? And he said, I tell them that, sell 15,000 season tickets, and if they don't, I tell them to hit the phones until they do. And what he meant by that was that it was really important to fill your building. If you fill your building in terms of the NHL, everything else will be easy. Sponsors will come, television deals will come, corporations will flock to the building. It's the fans that really own these teams, in my opinion.
And I guess my second question comes with, in recent years, more so than even the past, Hamilton has kind of been absorbed by the Toronto CMA with a lot of people just commuting into Toronto and the Greater Gorda Horseshoe becoming just kind of a multi-core city instead of a monocore city sort of model. Do you think that will heavily influence Hamilton getting a team in the future, with the Toronto Maple Leafs being more aggressive in protecting their exclusive zone?
Well, there's no question about that. I think the commissioner of the National Hockey League has said many, many times that no team in the NHL has a veto. And I think, obviously he's a lawyer. He knows Lex Scripta, which is the constitution of the NHL, better than the three of us. But having said that, I think there is an informal veto that both Buffalo and Toronto have. And I've talked to some of the people who would like to bring a team to the Hamilton area, or for that matter, a second team to the Toronto area. They kind of talked to me and asked me for my 2 cents. Probably that's what it's worth. And I said, look, if you are serious about bringing a team to this area, first you have to make a deal with Buffalo, and second you have to make a deal with Toronto, because otherwise, like the NHL is a club. It's like you had, Tim and Taylor, you had like a golf club, and there were 2 members in the golf club, you two. And I come along and I say to you, like Jim Balsillie did when he wanted to bring a team to Hamilton or to London or whatever. And I say to you, hey, I'd like to join your club. And you say, well, not sure we're expanding, and I'm not sure you're the right guy for us. Well, if you don't let me in, I'm going to sue you. Now, probably you guys would not take kindly to that. I certainly wouldn't. And I did say to Jim Balsillie when he was talking about bringing another team into that area that suing your way into a club, especially when the top 2 guys in the NHL are both, New York City lawyers, is probably a bad plan. You have to make a deal with Toronto and with Buffalo if you have any hope of bringing an NHL team to that area.
Was it the exact same way with your group, given how close Montreal is to Ottawa?
No. In the case of Toronto and Buffalo, there is it's the borders of the city of Toronto plus 50 miles, the border of the city of Buffalo plus 50 miles. That is the definition in Lex Scripta of your exclusion area. And Montreal's 120 miles, about, 200 kilometers from Ottawa. So their exclusion area did not include Ottawa. But if you look at Los Angeles, Bruce McNoll and the LA Kings, obviously the Anaheim Mighty Ducks, now just the Ducks, were within that 50-mile exclusion zone. So when Mike Eisner was the CEO of Disney at the time, and when I talked to Mike about bringing in the National Hockey League team to Anaheim, he had to make a deal first, at least in my opinion, with Bruce McNoll, which is what he did.
And I also assume that the Mouse probably has a much better legal strategy team than maybe any other company on the planet.
Well, money talks, what walks.
Exactly.
In December of 1990, you and your group traveled to Palm Beach, Florida, along with the group representing Tampa Bay, when the NHL officially announced they had accepted Ottawa's bid for a franchise to begin play for the 92-93 season during a press conference at the Breakers Hotel. One person of note that accompanied you and your group to Palm Beach was original Sens player Frank Finnigan. Majority of Sens fans today who don't know the original history of the Ottawa Senators would only know him from his retired number 8 at the Canadian Tire Center, and to a certain extent from the Twitter account Finnigan's Ghost. Talk to us a little bit about what kind of a person Frank was, and what was the feeling like in the room when the NHL accepted the bid?
Well, first, Frank, was a colorful individual. He had a storied life, and even well into his 80s when I met him, he had what I call hockey hands. If you've ever shaken hands with a professional hockey player, their hands are really powerful. And even in his late 80s, he still had those hockey hands and a powerful handshake, and he was a wonderful man. I asked Frank to come to Palm Beach to campaign for a National Hockey League expansion franchise for the city of Ottawa, and he was all over that. And I asked his son Frank Jr. to come as well, to take care of his dad and to be part of our group. And, the night before we actually got the franchise, Mr. Finnigan went up to John Ziegler, who was the president of the NHL at the time, soon to be replaced by Gary Bettner, the commissioner. And he went up to Mr. Ziegler with those big hockey hands, and he waves his big finger in front of John's face and says, Mr. Ziegler, you give those boys in Ottawa a fair chance tomorrow. and John assured him that he would. There's a lot of respect in the NHL for what's called the NHL family, and that means former players, former owners, former general managers, coaches. They are honored and in fact revered, and so I think his approach was, and being part of our group was really important. And I'm going to tell you a story. It makes me a little teary-eyed, but when we got the expansion franchise, and I'll talk a little bit more about that in a second, but when the NHL made the announcement that went something like this: "We are pleased and proud to announce today that the cities of Ottawa and Tampa have been accepted as conditional members of the National Hockey League." It was a wonderful moment, and I looked at Frank, and he was a bit teary-eyed too. And when we came back to Ottawa after winning the expansion franchise, we went through a season ticket campaign. I think we raised about $22.5 million in season ticket money in 10 days. We sold out all of our entire arena. So thank you, Mr. Wirtz, for that advice. But during the year where we spent time getting ready to play, that is to play in October of 1992, we had a number of things that we had to do. We had to face down the provincial government, which had changed. Liberal Premier David Peterson had been defeated by NDP Premier Bob Rae, and Mr. Rae and his government were opposed to the Ottawa Senators and wanted to see a franchise in Hamilton. So instead of getting the support that we had hoped to get from the government of Ontario, we got a lawsuit. Just as a side note, when Phil Esposito, who was representing, you guys know Phil Esposito, who he is, right?
Of course.
Yeah. So when Phil Esposito was representing the Tampa Bay Lightning, which was the other successful bid, he calls me up after a few weeks and said, "How's it going up there in Ottawa?" I said, "Oh, it's going okay." "And how's it going down there in Tampa?" "Oh, great. I got a call from the governor of the state of Florida congratulating us and asking what can he do, to help the Lightning get ready to play in 92. And he said, "How was the reaction when you got back to Ontario?" I said, "Well, yeah, we got a call too, but it was from the government of Ontario suing us." So, so we had a lot of work to do. But we went to something that's called the Ontario Municipal Board, which was an appeal board, where we were able, after a 13-week hearing, I was on the stand for 3.5 days being cross-examined by the Ontario government's lawyer. We were able to actually beat the Ontario government and Mr. Rae and his people and get the Palladium, i.e. the Canadian Tire Centre, approved, which was a wonderful step forward for us. But that meant we could qualify for unconditional membership in December of, 1991, so basically a year later. When we finally did that, I think it was December 19th, 1991, I turned to Randy and said, "Randy, you've got to call, Frank and make sure that he knows that we've gone from conditional members to unconditional members and that we've done it." So Randy immediately calls the hospital, because Frank was in the hospital at that time, and he couldn't speak to Frank, but he did speak to Frank Jr. And Frank Jr. later on told me that he went into the room where his dad effectively was dying, and he said to his dad, they've done it. And Frank gave a thumbs up, and he dictated to his son a letter, which I have here, congratulating me. He was too weak to write it, but he was able to sign it. I have it on my wall. Unfortunately, you guys can't see it right now. And after he had signed that, he looked at his son, he turned over, and he died. And, Frank Jr. said that was Dad's last mission on Earth. Once that was done, he was ready to go.
Wow.
That's amazing.
Yeah.
Yeah, so moving on to, some of my questions, and they may be a bit more kind of weird analytical in nature. One of the recurring themes in your book, Don't Stand Down, I butchered the title, but whatever, is NIMBYism in Ottawa. Can you kind of go over that and how you think that even plays into development decisions in the city of Ottawa today?
Yeah, well, NIMBY stands for Not in My Backyard, and the book is called Don't Back Down. It's I wrote that on the 25th anniversary of the team, and it's got 4 themes in it. It's got the original story of the founding of the Ottawa Senators. It's got a lot about the NHL. It's got a lot about real estate, and of course, it's got my story in there too. my wife told me, "Oh, Bruce, don't put your personal story in there. Nobody wants to read it." But it turns out that tens of thousands of people did want to read it. So people are curious as to why entrepreneurs do what they do and why they're so crazy. And so I kind of went into that a little bit in Don't Back Down. Tim, what was the question you asked?
Can you go into more detail about NIMBYism in Ottawa?
Yeah, the NIMBY thing. Well, NIMBY is everywhere. It's not just Ottawa. I mean, trust me, it exists in Duncan, BC. It exists in Calgary.
Oh, it certainly exists here.
Oh, everywhere. And what it is it's people are, people talk a good game, but people really don't like change. So Tim, let's say your neighbor, maybe he or she, they're nice people, but they decide to add a basement apartment to their house, because they may need a little bit of extra income. Young people, like my daughter, bought a house. I helped her buy a house, and she has an apartment in the basement of her house, and she has a very nice tenant there. But that monthly amount that she gets from her tenant does help her and her husband, pay their mortgage. So whether you're a young person or you're an older person like me, having a little bit of extra income can really be helpful. But if you're living next door and you find out your neighbor's putting a basement apartment in, and you think, oh my gosh, maybe that person might be somebody I don't like. They might be not like me. People are afraid of change. And so it's a reaction. It's based on two very powerful emotions, greed and fear. So in the case of the Canadian Tire Center, what happened was Bob Rae and his government, they opposed the rezoning because they thought, if they can't get the rezoning done, they won't be able to build their new stadium. They won't be able to become unconditional members of the National Hockey League, and therefore, the expansion franchise might go to Hamilton, which I thought was total nonsense. But that was at least the theory that the government was operating on. So that gave, encouragement to a number of people who I would consider, and you probably would too, who are NIMBYs. And there was one farmer in particular, I won't mention his name, it doesn't matter. He went to the OMB hearing every day for 13 and a half weeks during the summer. I don't know how a farmer gets to spend 13 and a half weeks in the middle of summer, at a hearing, but he was, he was raising issues about traffic and other things, and trying to convince the three panel members that this was a project that should not go forward. And fortunately for us, the panel members, the chair of the Ontario Municipal Board hearing, and the two others, did not agree with him or with the Ontario government, and they approved the construction of the Palladium. But the reason I'm telling you this is NIMBYism is a very funny thing. It was in fact 10 years after the building, the Canadian Tire Center, opened, the CBC, Canadian Broadcast Corporation, went out to interview this particular individual. And I was watching TV. It was a very random thing. And there he is on the 10th anniversary of this farmer who had been probably one of the most vocal NIMBYites in the area, being interviewed. And this young woman is out there, with her cameraman, and she's saying to him, so you were an opponent of the Palladium back in the day. How are you feeling on the 10th anniversary of the building? And he said, oh, no, I was never an opponent. And you could see the interviewer, the young woman who was interviewing him, sort of, do a double take. Well, yeah, you were there every day for 13 and a half weeks. You opposed them, and you said this. Oh, no, you have it wrong. I was always a supporter. And then he went on to say, his farm gate marketing business had boomed since the Canadian Tire Center had opened. Lots more people are driving by his farm. He has farm gate marketing, and his sales have been booming. He said, they've been a good neighbor. And so even though you might get a little bit of pushback from NIMBYs, if you keep at it for, as long as we did, eventually you can bring them on side.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's definitely something that a lot of developers are hoping for. I know it's definitely one of the topics of my research is as an urban economist. Next point, reading through the book, and you already mentioned bums and seats, there's a lot of funny metric names that came out in sports development. Which are your favorites?
Well, I didn't know what BIMS meant, bums in the seats, so I learned that. But for me, owning an NHL team, I think the biggest surprise to me was the fact that I felt a little bit like a feudal lord where you own people, right? You own the player. You own the player's contract. You take his life, basically his career, in your hands. And I was actually a little uncomfortable with that idea of owning, even if they're very well paid, they're still serfs. And some of the other owners, Tim, were quite comfortable with the idea of, trading people. It's not exactly the slave trade, but it certainly felt a little bit like that. So that was, to me anyway, a very strange feeling.
Mm-hmm.
And I don't think I've ever told anybody that before. So there you go.
Oh, we got something new here today.
I think you might have.
After all the years and hard work put into the revival of the Senators, the big night finally arrives. October 8th, 1992, opening night at the Ottawa Civic Centre versus the Montreal Canadiens. Outside of the game itself, which Ottawa won 5-3, the night was noted for its pre-game celebrations and having then unknown Alanis Morissette singing the national anthem, which she would later do again for Game 4 of the 2007 Stanley Cup Finals. What kind of emotions were you feeling that night, given all the work you'd put in? And in retrospect, how special was it having Alanis there that night, given how successful she would become a few years later?
Well, she was our honorary captain, when she was 17. She was a cute young woman. She came with us to our first draft in Montreal. We had a caravan bike via rail to Montreal. She was on that with us. And I think she had just cut one of her first albums, which had become enormously successful. And she was our honorary captain. So it really meant a lot to me, and I think to the fans, that she was with us. It's all about building a close relationship with your fans. I've never believed, by the way, that owners actually own these franchises. They hold them in trust for their fans.
One quick question I want to ask about the pregame celebrations. A few years ago, when the Vegas Golden Knights were an expansion team, they were known for their celebrations, which also included Roman soldiers and just the overall presentation. Given that the Senators had done that 25 years prior, did you kind of look at that and be like, oh, come on, this has already been done before?
Well, if you're successful, people will copy you. If you're not successful, obviously they won't. So, that did not bother me at all. I still have somewhere in my archives, a nice note from Mike Eisner at Disney. I sent him back in those days, I guess it would have been like a videotape. I sent him a videotape of the opening night celebrations, and I got a very nice note back from Mike saying it was an impressive opening night. When you talk to the president and CEO of Disney and he gives you that kind of compliment, that says something. And I think, the Golden Knights, yeah, I'm okay with that.
Awesome.
Actually, kind of jumping off of that, with the Senators lately having a lot of celebrations, especially for players retiring or players coming back, do you think the Senators over the years have maintained a strong ability to keep fans engaged in the building?
I would say the answer to that is probably no at this stage. The Ottawa Senators before COVID-19 has, I think, the smallest front office staff. It's really a skeleton staff. And some of the programs that I put in place, the Ottawa Senators Foundation, which is a charity for children, the Junior Fan Club, and some of the other long-term investments that we made in our fan base, some of that has kind of a little bit fallen by the wayside, due to budget cuts. And I think those budget cuts are really having an impact on like I said earlier in this interview, on the love affair between the team and its fans. And I don't know really what to do about that. You asked me what was it like on opening night in October of 1992. And Cyril Leader, Randy Sexton, and I, we stood at gate 1 and we shook hands with fans as they came into the building. Having an owner in the building is really, really, really important. It doesn't matter whether it's Major League Baseball or National Football League football or NBA activities. Having an owner, living, breathing every moment. If you think about Mike Ilitch, he was absolutely beloved by his players in Detroit, and he just bled for that team. Same thing with Bill Wirtz in Chicago, and players, coaches, trainers, fans, sponsors, they all know that. And the fact that the current owner in Ottawa, I think, can only work in Canada for 15 days a year because I think he's in a tax haven, Bermuda or Bahamas or whatever it is. I can't remember. Barbados, I think. I think that really hurts, the team and its relationship with the entire stakeholder group.
Well, I know talking about sports owners, especially in the United States, one of the most well-known owners, I think for his interactions with not only the fans, but how open he is with the media, is Mark Cuban for the Dallas Mavericks.
No question. No question. And by the way, it's not just true of professional sports franchises. Taylor, it's true of, you can't run a shoe store. You can't run a restaurant. Try and run a pub where the owner never shows up. You're not going to be successful. Having an owner in the house really makes a difference to everybody, the entire stakeholder group. One of my best friends owns or at least until recently, owned a very, very successful pub. It's been around for a very long time, and he's in the pub saying hi to people, making sure things are running properly and the staff is happy and the customers are happy. There's just no replacement for that.
So, Bruce, following the Sens inaugural season, you announced your resignation from the Ottawa Senators as well as Terrace Investments in August of 1993. Following your announcement, you would later join the Canadian Football League's Ottawa Roughriders as part owner and chairman. From what I was reading regarding your resignation, it was due to the financial strain put on from completing the payment for the team as well as the building of the Palladium. Overall, what were the reasons for your resignation from the Sens, and how did you become involved with the Roughriders?
So what happened was when we got the franchise, the Canadian dollar was trading around 90 cents to the U.S. dollar, and all of our contracts were denominated in Canadian currency. The only contracts that we had, player contracts, were in U.S. dollars, were for players that we traded, who came from, say, the New York Rangers with a U.S. dollar contract, which obviously we had to pay. So in 1992-93, our budget for our players was $6.5 million Canadian dollars, and that included both the big and the little team, the American Hockey League affiliate. So it was $6.5 million Canadian dollars, and even though we were playing at that time in the Civic Center, which was only about 10 or 12,000 seats, we were able to make about $9.6 or $9.8 million in earnings that year. So we were very profitable in the second smallest NHL building. But what happened was the NHL, the NHLPA, basically the Players Association, I think ate the NHL's lunch. They insisted on denominating all of the player contracts, even for players playing in Canada, in U.S. dollars. And that was the death knell, I think, for the Quebec Nordiques, the Winnipeg Jets, and almost for the Ottawa Senators, and certainly for me. So our payroll went from $6.5 million Canadian dollars to $84 million in a very, very short period of time. Just try that in your pub or your shoe store, right? Good luck with that. And so what had happened was we had a couple of setbacks. That was certainly one of them. The other was that we had to make an arrangement with the Ontario Municipal Board. We wanted the entire 600 acres that we bought rezoned. 100 acres we would keep for the building, and 500 acres where the value of the land hopefully would go up. We would sell it, and that would be a big additional capital injection for our company. That didn't happen. Mr. Ray and his people managed to cut us off at the knees. So we took a few financial hits. One, the payroll ran out of control. Two, we didn't get the extra 500 acres of land rezoned. That took another generation, 25 years. And the third thing was that Mr. Ray forced us to pay for the Palladium interchange. It's still, I think, to this day, the only interchange on a 400 series highway in Ontario that was paid for by the private sector. And so we took a $30 million write-down on the interchange. We took a $50 million write-down on the value of our land. And then we took a huge hit on the payroll side. So I knew... probably even on opening day, boys, I knew that my days as an NHL owner was probably limited.
One thing that was brought up when you were talking about the death knell for the Quebec Nordiques and the Winnipeg Jets, and I know that Gary Bettman gets a lot of criticism up here in Canada for the relocation of those teams, and of course with the southern team struggling, given that I think he came up with a difference in the money to save teams in Calgary and Edmonton and Vancouver. Do you feel if he had not put that in place that Ottawa would have joined Quebec and Winnipeg as an American team?
Yeah, I do. A lot of Canadians are not maybe fond of Gary Bettman. I understand their concerns and arguments, but at least in terms of Ottawa, Mr. Bettman went to bat for the Senators when they went bankrupt in the mid 2000s, and as a result, I had to restart my career. And I was 54 years of age. I'd had a wonderful career, lots of ups, and all of a sudden, oops, there I am, restarting at age 54, not at 34, but at 54. But Gary definitely went to bat for the Ottawa Senators. He wanted the Sens, to stay. He wanted an NHL team in Canada's capital city, and I think if Gary were to go back to the time where Quebec went to Colorado, maybe he might have done something different. He certainly stepped in the case of Ottawa, and of course Phoenix. The Coyotes wouldn't be in Phoenix today except for Gary Bettman saying, "We're not putting our franchises on roller skates."
In 2012, you received the highest honor in Ottawa sports by way of being inducted into the Ottawa Sports Hall of Fame, along with Randy Sexton and Cyril Leader. The Ottawa Sports Hall of Fame has inducted a number of significant people over the years involved with Ottawa sports, including Frank Finnigan, Brian Kilray, and Frank Clare. For yourself, when did you learn that you were being inducted into the Hall, and did your induction feel that much more significant knowing that Cyril and Leader were being inducted along with you?
Yeah, I think it made, I've never asked for public recognition. And one of the things, we talked about earlier in this interview was some of the things that I found a little uncomfortable. One of them was, as I mentioned, owning players. The other was owning a franchise in the sense that I really believe that owners hold it in trust for the fans. So I didn't really want, the kind of media attention that I got. I didn't realize, this is my naivete, it's on me, the amount of focus and attention that you get as an NHL owner in Canada. To me, that was not something that I would have sought the spotlight, for. And I just wasn't prepared for that. I thought, we'd have a publicist, we'd have a public relations group, I'd have a president of the team, in this case, Cyril Leader, we'd have a coach, we'd have a general manager, that the owner can take a step back into the shadows. That did not happen. And, so being inducted into the Ottawa Sports Hall of Fame was a wonderful honor, and I certainly appreciate it. But again, to go into the public eye, I have a very private life. Now, I'm doing this interview with you guys, but I don't spend a lot of time going back over history. To me, now it's ancient history. And I think for most people, if you're going to be successful as an individual, I'm not talking about financial success, I just mean a happy person and a person who has a good family life. You have to live in the present. You can't live in the past. I think that's a mistake. So other than doing this podcast with you guys, I probably won't talk about this again. I am 68, so who knows?
Sticking with your induction to the Ottawa Sports Hall of Fame, I know the Ottawa Senators have the Ring of Honor that they introduced a few years ago. Now, at the time of this recording, only one member of the Ottawa Senators is a part of that, the late Brian Murray. Do you think that we'll ever see the day that you yourself is inducted into the Ring of Honor?
Well, that's not up to me to decide. And, these honors are I do appreciate it. Maybe I sound like I don't, but I do. It means a lot to me and to be thanked. There are still people who, mostly older people now, who will come up to me on the street if they recognize me. I am a lot older, obviously. And they'll say, thank you for bringing the team back. And I appreciate that. I went to a game earlier this year where we could go to games, and a fan from Germany came up to me. I don't know how he recognized me, but he did. And we become like email buddies, and he read Don't Back Down. His English is as good as yours or mine. And, And I do enjoy that fan interaction on a one-on-one basis. But the idea of, being trotted out publicly to do, this kind of thing, that really wasn't me. I should have been a university professor. I was being trained to be a university professor. Look at the career I actually ended up with.
You probably got the better end of the stick, honestly, looking at academia nowadays.
Well, I don't know, but, I was a very shy person. And, the first interview I did, there were lots of ums and ahs and, whatever. And when the first person came up to me and wanted my autograph, I went, you want my autograph?
Yeah, I would imagine that's such a weird thing for you, given that, you haven't been involved with the Ottawa Senators since the early 90s. And given that, as you're saying, that fan from Germany recognized you and you became email pals, I can only imagine that must still be a weird thing for you if you go to games that people end up recognizing you.
Yeah, I think that's true, and that's never going to go away. However long I live, I'll always be the founder of the Ottawa Senators, and I know no one loves the team more than I do.
Yeah. Well, one thing, and even reading through your book and watching old interviews, and the one thing I really appreciate about you, Bruce, is that for most people, when they do something as significant as founding a sports team, that's the one thing that they say, yes, that's the one thing that I will always be remembered for. But from what I was seeing, your attitude was always more of founding the Ottawa Senators is just one of the things that I did. Is that something that consciously you were thinking of, or is that just your personality? Like, yeah, it's great, but that's just one of the things that I did.
Tay, I really appreciate you saying that, because you got it right. Like, I'm doing some things now in terms of the coaching that I do, real estate investment and business coaching that I do, that is changing lives. And, I help people take care of themselves and their families for 3 generations by learning to be real estate investors and to run their own personal business for life. And some of the work that I'm doing is really biting. You can see it. I'm now coaching thousands of people across Canada, the United States, in Australia, and in Sweden, of all places. And so the opportunity to give back, I think about it. I've been a university professor. I've been a hockey guy. I've been a real estate developer. Now I'm a realtor and a coach. And so, especially now on COVID-19, on the long weekend, Easter long weekend, Good Friday morning, I woke up and I thought, I should reboot a course that I taught at the Sprott School of Business at Carleton University and also at the Telfer School of Management at the University of Ottawa. It was called Entrepreneurial Culture. So I updated the course and I launched it 3 weeks later. It's called Pivot. And I'm teaching people how to build successful businesses. And today, with, like I said earlier in the interview, with 7 million Canadians unemployed, that's an incredible number. 40 million Americans lost their jobs in 2 months. So it's my chance, in a small way, to teach people how to run their own personal business for life, so that they never get laid off again.
So, Bruce, after everything that we've got a chance to talk with you about today, I feel the best way to close out the questions is by bringing up the fact that you wrote a book about the Sens titled "Don't Back Down." Now, I got a chance to read through some of the book in preparation for this interview, and I actually want to thank you for sending me the PDF copy of it. And I actually found myself not being able to put it down once I started reading. Now, given I'm only about 125, 150 pages into the book, and I was reading some of it last night, how long did the book project start from start to finish? And can you tell us the backstory behind the title of the book?
Yeah. So, yes, I will. And I'm glad you asked that, Taylor. So, Don't Back Down is a riff on Tom Petty's song, of the same name. And that was our theme song when we were trying to bring back the Ottawa Senators. We wouldn't back down. And there were some down moments as we tried to bring the Ottawa Senators back, a team that had not played in nearly 60 years. And I'll tell you a story that I really think I should share with your listeners. And that is the story that happened the night before we actually got the team. There was about a 600-person NHL family dinner, one of those fancy dinners. And there were lots of competitors there, looking for NHL expansion franchises. Portland, Seattle, Milwaukee, Hamilton, Ottawa, Tampa Bay, St. Petersburg, probably a couple I don't remember. And so all the bidders were there, and all the NHL members of the Board of Governors were there. The NHL family was there, and everybody was, lobbying, telling the members of the Board of Governors why St. Petersburg should get a team, why Milwaukee should have a team, why Hamilton should have a team, and of course why Ottawa should have a team. And about halfway through the dinner, one of the members of the Board of Governors comes up to me, and he puts his face about 6 or 8 inches away from mine, and he says, "Mr. Firestone, there's just one thing I want to tell you." And I said, "Oh, okay, well, what is it?" He said, "You will never, ever, ever get an NHL franchise in Ottawa." And he was wagging his finger at me. And I went, "Well, by that time we had bought $7.5 million worth of land. We'd spent $2.5 or $3 million on the bid. We had sold 15,000 priority registration numbers for season tickets. We had 500 corporate sponsors. I'm thinking to myself, oh my God, I've just spent the last 4 years of my life and it's going down the toilet. I'm going to have to find a new hometown if we don't win this thing." And what I said to him is, I said, I think the NHL should give teams, expansion franchises to cities and people who truly love, and appreciate NHL hockey and will cherish the franchise, will take care of it. And that, sir, would be us. He said, "Well, you heard what I have to say. You will never get a team in Ottawa." And he walks away. So I went back to our table and I sat down. My face was white as a ghost. And people came up to me. They said, "Are you okay, Bruce?" And you guys are men, so you know what happens when you're under a lot of stress. Your voice might go up an octave or two. So I remember some guys coming up to me, Randy, Cyril, others, and saying, "Bruce, what's wrong? Are you okay?" And I said, "Oh yeah, everything's good. Yeah, fine." Obviously it wasn't. And finally, Norm Green, who was the owner of the Minnesota North Stars, came over to see me. He was a friend of mine. And Norm turned to me and said, "What's wrong?" And so I did tell Norm what had happened. Well, he said, "Look, that's one vote you're not going to get. Get that schmucky look off your face, kid, and get out there and hustle." I went, "My gosh, Norman's right." I said, "Thank you, Norm. I hear you." So I continued to, lobby, not that one governor, but the others I did. And so the next morning we got up early. It was 5 o'clock or 6 o'clock in the morning. We go down, and this is the Breakers Hotel in Palm Beach. And they're the members of the Board of Governors having breakfast. And I look around the room, and the only other person in the room was Phil Esposito, doing the same thing I was, sitting down, having coffee with one governor, saying, reminding him of all the good things that Ottawa's done to earn this franchise. And I look around, where's Hamilton? Where's Milwaukee? Where's St. Petersburg? Where's Seattle? Where's Portland? Where's Houston? Houston was there. Nobody was there. And I thought, oh, good. So the last thing the members of the Board of Governors saw before they closed the doors to decide where to put a team, or their teams, was my face saying, "Go Ottawa! Remember the Sens! Bring back the Senators!" And the second last thing they saw was Phil Esposito saying, "Hey, we're here for the Tampa Bay Lightning. We're your next franchise." And nobody else was there. So, at that point, we didn't know if we would be successful or not. And so we waited throughout the morning, and, the stress level was very high. I won't take up too much more time, but I'll finish the story if that's okay with you guys.
Yep, go for it.
So around noon, the pressure's getting, I said, oh my God, they're going to be in there all day. So I told my staff that I'm going to go for a run. I like to run. And so I went jogging, and around 50 minutes later, I'm coming back, and there in front of the Breakers Hotel is Connie Neal, who was my executive assistant, and Cyril and a couple other. Hurry up! They're waving me in, so I run a little faster, and I said, "What's up?" "Oh, the NHL's made a decision." I said, "Okay, what decision?" "We don't know. We've been told to go up into our suite and wait, and they're going to come and collect us at 1. So I go up into the suite. I don't have time for a shower. I just kind of towel off and change into my suit. And NHL security comes, and they collect us. And they take us down a back staircase into the basement of the Breakers Hotel. And the Breakers Hotel looks a lot like the Overlook Hotel in The Shining. I don't know if you guys ever saw the movie The Shining with Jack Nicholson. But it's kind of a scary hotel. And there we are in the basement, myself, Cyril Eder, Randy Sexton, Gary Burns, Jim Durrell, who was the mayor of Ottawa at the time, Elliot Richardson, former U.S. Attorney General. We're all there in the basement where the prep kitchen is. The pipes are leaking, the garbage everywhere. I'm expecting rats and Jack Nicholson with an axe at any minute. And I thought, holy smokes, looks like we have not been successful. So I turned to our group and I said, look, guys, it doesn't look very hopeful. We couldn't have done any more. We have worked as hard as we possibly can for as long as we can. If we're not successful today, we are going to thank the NHL for the opportunity to bid. Then we're going to hold our own press conference. And at that press conference, we're going to say, look, we weren't successful today, partly, I think, because the provincial government of Mr. Ray has opposed the building of the Palladium. We're going to go back to Ontario. We're going to beat the government at their own game. We're going to get that approved. And next year, we're coming back to these winter meetings, and we're going to get our franchise 12 months from now. That's what we're going to say. So with that, we prepare for the worst possible news. So a few minutes later, NHL security takes us up to the Board of Governors where the room was, and we enter into the Board of Governors room, and there's Marcel Aubu, who was the owner of the Quebec Nordiques, and he comes up to me and he says, "Félicitations, ami." He was a big guy. He gives me a big hug. I go, "Oh, yeah, okay, thanks." And I thought he was just congratulating us on a good try. I get to the front of the room, and there's John Ziegler, the president of the National Hockey League. There's Phil Esposito. And I looked down on a piece of paper. It says, the NHL is pleased and proud to announce that conditional memberships have been granted to the cities of Ottawa and Tampa. And I went, oh my God, we just won this thing. And what had happened was the NHL decided to put the winners in the basement to keep them away from the media, and the losers were upstairs. But I didn't know that. So, you go from the depths of depression, I guess, to the heights of ecstasy. And I turned to my guys, and we just go, oh my God, we just won this thing. So we go back to Ottawa. We do our season ticket campaign. And about 3 weeks later, I get a call from that member of the Board of Governors. And he said to me, "Bruce, do you remember what I said to you the night before you got the team?" I said, "I certainly do. I'll go to my grave remembering it. You will never, ever, ever get an NHL franchise in Ottawa." He said, me and two of the other members of the board decided to go up to every single bidder, Houston, Portland, Seattle, Hamilton, Tampa Bay, St. Petersburg, etc., Ottawa, and say exactly that thing. You will never, ever, ever get a franchise in Houston or Hamilton. We wanted to see how the bidders would react. And the only two bidders that kept on going were you and Phil Esposito. And that's who we gave franchises to because we trusted you.
I'm actually really surprised that Hamilton backed down.
Mr. Joyce, who was representing the Hamilton bid, he was, the Tim Hortons donut king, got mad and left.
Huh.
And so did Milwaukee and Houston and Seattle and Portland. Everybody got mad. Phil didn't. I didn't. We just got back to work. So it turns out, boys, they don't give franchises to cities. They give them to people.
I guess if there's an ownership certificate, that is the reality of the situation.
There you go. So I just wanted to share that with you and your listeners.
Oh, and one quick comment from reading the book. I can definitely tell that you have a PhD. It's structured like an academic would. Take that as you will.
I think you just punctured my balloon.
I mean, I'm one as well, so it felt really natural to read.
Oh, well, I'm glad you enjoyed it. At least I hope you did.
So, Tim, do you have any more comments you want to make for Bruce before we head off into the close for another episode?
No, I think we've made good time on this episode.
Absolutely. Bruce, we cannot thank you enough for joining us, and I speak for every Senators fan when I say that we owe you the biggest of debt in everything you did for bringing back the Ottawa Senators. We greatly appreciate that. Now, before we let you go, we always get our guests to plug their social media. Now, for our listeners, if they hear this and want to reach out to you and say, hey, this was a great interview, or they just want to give their comments, where can they find you on social media?
So I'm on Twitter, @Prof Bruce, so @Prof Bruce. That's my Twitter handle. I'm on LinkedIn. I think it's the same handle, Prof Bruce. I'm on Facebook. I think it's probably the same handle. And I have a website, brucemfirestone.com. You have to put the M in there, brucemfirestone.com. But anybody who wants to reach out to me to talk about the Senators, to talk about the NHL, to talk about the coaching that I do and some of the things that I do, if they want to read Don't Back Down, they can find me, and they certainly can email me if they want to, Bruce.Firestone, Firestone, @century21.ca, and that's the numbers 21.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Bruce.
I really enjoyed this. I hope you did too, boys.
Oh, we had a bunch of fun.
All right, see ya.
See ya.
Yeah.
You know, Tim, that was a great interview that we got a chance to talk with Bruce Firestone.
I feel like I learned a lot.
We did. Now, what were some of the things that you took away from this interview today, Tim?
Well, I think one of the big ones is once an academic, always an academic, but I mean that in a great way because it's very detailed and it seemed someone who's very complete at looking at the world, a complete way of looking at the world, and honestly, it was just a fun chat.
Well, guys, thank you so much for listening to the Third Line Plug Senscast. I hope you've enjoyed it because, believe me, Tim and I love recording it for you. You can find us on the National Podcast Network, nationalpodcast.network. We can find our page on SoundCloud, iTunes, and Google Play. We're also on Twitter at Third Line Plug is our Twitter handle. Tim is at M9HoneyBadger, and I'm at Great White Gipster, GR8WYTE Gipster. If you want to shoot us an email to talk about our interview today with Dr. Bruce Firestone, you can shoot us an email, thirdlineplugSenscast@gmail.com. Until next time, guys, I am your host, Taylor Gibson.
And this has been Tim Gensey.
Go Sens, guys.
Woo!
So long, my time here is up. They're going home.